I found that science, as it related to physics and chemistry, as exciting as it was not as interesting to me as I began to learn more about biology and what was happening in terms of an understanding of life and how the scientific process might be used to figure out how life works. And changing directions in a rather drastic way, I decided, although I was well along with a PhD in chemistry, that I would go to medical school. I loved the experience of learning about the human body and all of the components of that, and I particularly loved being introduced to genetics, understanding, of course, that DNA was the information molecule and it was mathematical in a certain way. It resonated with my other preferences for the kind of science I liked most. But then I ended up in the medical school curriculum sitting at the bedside of patients with diseases. This was no longer an abstract study of molecules and organ systems. These were real people. And I realized soon enough that the medical methods we had to help many of these people were imperfect and were not going to pull them back from what awaited them in terms of a death that we weren't going to be able to stop. Many of them had cancer, others heart disease, a variety of incurable illnesses. We could make them comfortable, we might be able to help for a bit, but ultimately we were going to lose that battle, and they were going to lose their battle. And that was a struggle for me. Up until then, the idea of life and death had been all about philosophy and abstractness, and now it was very real. I was puzzled how these good people in this hospital were, for the most part, not angry about their circumstance. I thought I would be. They instead seemed to be resigned, at peace, realizing that their life was coming to an end, and actually many of them talking about how their faith was giving them comfort. This was a rock that they stood upon. They were not afraid. I realized I would be afraid. I didn't know what lay on the other side. I suspected nothing at all. And one afternoon, one of my patients, a wonderful elderly woman, much like a grandmother, who had very bad heart disease and had suffered mightily for it, and for whom we'd essentially run out of options. She had a particularly bad episode of chest pain while I was with her. She got through it, and at the end of that, explained to me how her faith was the thing that helped her in that situation. She realized that the doctors around her weren't really giving her that much help, but her faith was. And after she finished her own very personal description of that faith, she turned to me, and I had been silent, and she looked at me quizzically, and she said, "You know, doctor, I've just shared my personal faith in Christ with you, and I thought you might actually say something, but you haven't said anything. What do you believe, doctor?" Nobody'd ever asked me that question so point blank, and in such an honest way. And I felt the color rising in my face, and I felt this intense disquiet about even being there. And I stammered something about not being quite sure, and I left the room as fast as I could. And I puzzled over what had happened there and why it had been so unsettling. And ultimately, I had to admit to myself that her question had made me realize that I had arrived at an answer to the most important issue that we humans ever deal with. Is there a God? And I had arrived there without ever really looking at the evidence. And I was supposed to be a scientist. If there's one thing scientists claim they do, is to arrive at conclusions based upon evidence. And I hadn't taken the trouble to do that. Now, I was pretty sure there wasn't any, but I had to admit that I didn't know. And I also had to admit that around me, I knew of substantive people in the medical school who were believers, and I had puzzled about that, and I'd never actually considered what they might describe as the basis for their faith, and maybe it was time to learn something about that. Maybe this wasn't all just superstition, or at least maybe there was something there to understand.